carry chlorine residual all the way through that, you don't have a quenching cost. And for a 20 MGD plant, that would save about $500,000 to $600,000 a year in just quenching costs. So again, you're potentially improving the efficiency and you're reducing your operating costs by using UV chlorine. A couple things about ozone. Here we have drinking water source. What we're looking at is the removal of these various contaminants with ozone and ozone peroxide. And you can see these graphs are very similar in shape. The difference is that it's a bit steeper up front, so it takes a little bit less ozone when you add peroxide in a drinking water matrix. But when we switch over to wastewater and typical reuse application, remember that I said that ozone will react with effluent organic matter to create its own advanced oxidation process. So we don't see a great deal of difference when you add peroxide or not. So if you designed a wastewater treatment system with ozone peroxide, you'd essentially be throwing a chemical in that you don't need. You can get that same amount of oxidation with the effluent organic matter that's present. One other piece to this is a bit complicated of a graph. There are a number of things on it. Again, we're looking at the estrogenic activities with the bioassay response. So what we see here is these first three bars are with ultrafiltration, these last three bars are sand filtration, and we're moving through secondary effluent filtration and then ozone peroxide. And here we've added BAC. This is biologically active granular activated carbon. And what we see is a fantastic removal of not only the contaminants, but also any residual estrogenic activity that may have been present. And in terms of thinking about reuse, this offers a much lower energy reuse scheme than, say, the traditional RO followed by UV advanced oxidation process, because you don't have the pressure associated with pumping that you would in an RO scheme. This would not necessarily be good for direct potable reuse, but it could be a good option for groundwater injection, upward for storage and recovery. 1,4-dioxane, this is a contaminant that is used as a benchmark in California. Again, looking at ozone versus ozone peroxide. Again, not a huge difference in wastewater applications. Peroxide doesn't add a lot of benefit to the system. And NDMA, here we are again, just showing that you do see some removal with ozone peroxide, but again, it's really UV that does the work for you. So again, you could, if you threw enough ozone at it, you could get a little bit of NDMA removal, but really you need UV photolysis to make that happen. Okay, one more system that I want to talk about here, and then I'll get into the energy components of this. So this is a pilot that we did thinking about that California paradigm where you have membrane pretreatment, reverse osmosis, followed by UV advanced oxidation. What we did is we took that advanced oxidation process and we actually put it in front of the RO membranes to see if we could change the life of the membranes in the valley. Again, a very different study. But what I want to point out in this picture here, we have a number of aerobic and anaerobic zones. This is the membrane bioreactor tank. It's very difficult to see in this picture. Back here is what's called a hypox reactor. It's an ozone or ozone peroxide system. And then this last skid here is the RO membrane skid, and we had chemical injection too for biofouling control and anti-scalants. But this paper was published this year, and what I want to show you is the trace contaminant aspect of it. So if we look at the membrane bioreactor itself, there is some removal through the MBR process of these various contaminants. Again, we're looking at parts per trillion concentration. Most of that removal is either due to sorption to the solids within the MBR system or to some biodegradation. But once you look at the RO permeate, we see very low concentrations, below detection across the board, except for carbamazepine, which is right here. We see some of it showing up in the RO permeate. If you add ozone up front of that, even the carbamazepine is gone. So again, really great removal of these contaminants to below detection limits. Another system that we looked at was the PhotoCat. This is a membrane incorporated system. It actually uses UV light with titanium dioxide. This is a nanoparticle-based process. But the interesting thing here is this concept of the EEO. So this is the electrical energy required to get 90% removal of a given contaminant. And what you have here are a number of contaminants that are graphed, and the electrical energy to get 90% reduction of contaminants. And what you see is that UV titanium dioxide actually takes more energy in most cases than if you remove the titanium dioxide from the system altogether. And or if you added peroxide, you even get a better removal. So the manufacturer really didn't like us for publishing this paper because we basically showed that the process was inefficient and they'd be better off taking the titanium dioxide out and just going with UV photolysis. But the point here is for those of you working with utilities and consulting firms, I can almost guarantee you that any manufacturer of a process can come and demonstrate at your facility that they can remove whatever contaminant it is that they promise that they can remove. The question you have to ask them is how much energy did it take to get you there? And that's why this EEO concept is so great, because it allows you to put technologies side by side and actually rate their ability in terms of an energy input to get you where you want to be in terms of your treatment goals. Another one that we looked at, published a couple years ago, this was a non-thermal plasma. Very interesting technology. It's like taking a plasma TV, turning it on its side, putting a stainless steel plate underneath it, and letting a laminar sheet of water flow across that plate. And what you're looking at in this picture is inside of the reactor. It looks like a purple electrical storm. Lots of little lightning arcs occurring within the system. And what it's doing is producing UV light, it's producing hydroxyl radicals, it's producing ozone. It's really all-encompassing advanced oxidation process. Really needs to work on, really great to work with, but not so efficient. So let me explain what I have here. Again, we've got contaminants along this column, and then the NTP is the non-thermal plasma. This is wastewater, spiked surface water, and then we're looking at UV, UV peroxide, UV titanium dioxide, and ozone. And these are all, again, the electrical energy to remove 90% of contaminant. So for methylbromate, say for example, in the non-thermal plasma in wastewater, would have taken 10 kilowatt hours per cubic meter of water treated to remove 90% of methylbromate. With ozone, it would have taken 0.4 kilowatt hours to have that same removal. So again, ozone dominates as your treatment of choice for these particular contaminants. Again, it's not universal. If you're looking for NDMA removal, ozone's not going to do it for you. So you have to match the process to the contaminant you're concerned about. We also did a study for the Water Reuse Research Foundation where we developed a number of models for different contaminants. And you can think of contaminants by their chemistry and their reactivity with different treatment processes. So we grouped them here into 5 groups. California uses 9 different groups of contaminants for measuring treatment systems. But what this does, this is the ozone to TOC ratio. So if you have a TOC in your water, organic carbon content of your water, of say, I'm just going to make up a number, to make it easy, we'll say there's 10 milligrams of TOC per liter. If you add 5 milligrams of ozone, you have an ozone to TOC dose of 0.5. So what you can do is say, okay, well, if I want to pick a dose of, say, ozone to TOC of 1, what am I going to remove? Well, you'll get greater than 90% removal of groups 1 and 2. You'll get about 90% removal of group 3, somewhere between 50 and 70% removal of group 4, and probably around 10 to 15% removal of group 1. So this allows you to, again, weigh out your dosing schemes versus contaminant removal based on chemistry in wastewater. So it's a nice way to sort of initially evaluate the system. We took this one step further, and we actually developed conceptual level cost curves. So in this report that is about to be published, you can go in and say, okay, I want to do ozone, I want to do reverse osmosis, oh, and I need an MF microfiltration piece to it. You add it all up, and you can get a conceptual level cost for not only the energy and the operation and maintenance costs, but also the capital. So here's an example. This is looking at ozone with 10 milligrams per liter of TOC, an ozone to TOC ratio of 0.3, 0.6, and 1.2. Capital costs, again, you can look at the difference, but the power is that you can size your system based on how much removal. So if you want to get 90% removal up to group 3, you need to spend $32 million on a system with about $8 million a year on O&M costs, operation and maintenance, versus, say, considering a lower percentage removal and lowering your capital and operation and maintenance costs. Again, conceptual level, but it allows you to compare different options. If we look again at ozone with biological activated carbon, microfiltration, different processes, you can look at these capital costs associated with it, and let's just pick 10 MGD and look across what's happening here. Typically, the more advanced treatment options cost more money. That's intuitive. The interesting thing is the operation and maintenance cost. Most of that's embedded in the reverse osmosis. Again, that pumping is required to remove the salts and the contaminants out of the water itself. So coming back around to reuse and this question, I know I've digressed significantly off of the question of does it matter that drugs are in our water supplies, but I do want to come back to that point. In these 2012 EPA guidelines, again, you can find them online at waterreuseguidelines.org. They're, again, looking at different models of reuse. So microfiltration, reverse osmosis, UV advanced oxidation with some sort of environmental buffer. This is what we were talking about earlier today. And then looking at granular activated carbon with ozone and thinking about alternative strategies for that. And how could you achieve the public health goals that you want with potentially less energy and cost. This is a hugely enormous table. I only put it up here to show you that it's there. And what it does is it lists different compounds. Again, they're abbreviated, but you can read down here. I'll leave these slides. And looks through different wastewater treatment processes up through advanced oxidation and gives you approximate percentage removals based on pilot and full-scale data collected from the literature. So again, that table's in those reuse guidelines. Definitely take a look if you're interested. All right, coming back to this point, it doesn't matter that pharmaceuticals are turning up in our water supplies. We see we're getting orders of magnitude greater exposure through air, through food. I didn't talk about food as much, but it's definitely an interesting piece of the puzzle. So let's go back to this paper, this 2009 paper. Again, the data were made public in 2007, 2008, so latter part of the last decade. In 2011, the World Health Organization published a report, and I think that this is pretty telling. In that report, they said that adverse health impacts to humans are very unlikely from exposure to pharmaceuticals and drinking water, and that those concentrations are generally more than 100-fold lower than the minimum therapeutic dose, and that the risk to human health arising from exposure to these contaminants is extremely unlikely. And that's really where the body of evidence has been headed. So just because we can detect these compounds in drinking water doesn't necessarily mean that there's a risk. And there's a whole lot of toxicology and evaluation that goes into those statements. But I think that it's really important to remember, we're looking at parts per trillion concentration. Very, very low levels. You would have to drink, George, do you remember Shane's analogy? How many swimming pools of water you have to drink for a dose of aspirin?
I have a slightly different. If you have 20 parts per trillion in water, you would have to drink 496,000 8-ounce glasses of water to get what a woman gets in one birth control pill.
Yes. Very low. And there's some great resources that have those facts and figures in them, relating it to the amount of water you have to drink. And in all cases, you would have died from overconsumption of water well before you really the dose. So, bringing that all back together, really in terms of human health, we're not talking about a great deal of risk from pharmaceuticals and personal care products. We understand the pathways to the environment. We know how they're getting there. We know that we live and we practice water reuse. Whether we choose to embrace that or not is a different issue. But we all live within water recycling systems. We know that wastewater and drinking water are forever linked. They will always be together. And as long as we're detecting these compounds, you know that there's some sort of a wastewater source upstream. The contaminants are ubiquitous. We're finding them everywhere. There are all sorts of different pathways. In terms of addressing the risks in potable reuse applications, multi-barrier techniques are the way to go. You need multiple types of technologies to get these contaminants contaminants below threshold concentrations. And really, when we think about environmental impacts, if you embrace water reuse and you understand the goals of your treatment in wastewater and drinking water, then you can actually mitigate some of your environmental impacts. You can lessen the impact by simply saying a primary treatment is going to suffice, and I'll throw that in the river, and we don't really care what happens downstream. If you make an intentional choice, you can deal with contaminants, you can deal with the problems associated with discharges. Just reviewing the treatment processes themselves, we talked about advanced oxidation. The key here is that either you change the contaminant into something new, or you put it in some other box that you or somebody else has to use. So you've got to keep that in mind as you're making your decisions. And really, the key is that you have to evaluate the energy costs. Anything that you want to do, you've got to weigh out what are the costs and what are the benefits, really, in terms of the treatment process itself. Membranes certainly provide really effective barriers to emerging contaminants and pathogens, and in many cases can remove those contaminants below the limits of detection. Multi-barrier techniques provide the most overall benefit, and there are lots of ways to get rid of these micropollutants, but at what cost? So what I want to close with is this last slide. And this idea has been floating around in my mind for a long time, but I showed you the Colorado River example where we saw a decrease in lake volume and increase in contaminants. That happened to be microconstituents. There are a lot of other contaminants that we could look at. What we know is that as you have impaired water qualities, we tend to throw more treatment technologies in. And those treatment technologies come with an energy cost. And those energy costs are linked to power production, greenhouse gas emission, mercury emission, all sorts of other things that impact our environment. We then look at climate change, throw that in there, and as climate change happens, as your lake volumes drop, as you get more extreme storm events, more wastewater discharges, you have impaired your water quality further, you come back around the cycle, and you're stuck throwing more treatment technologies at it. So as we look at that and think about it, we have to understand what are our off-ramps. How do you get out of this cycle? And then you see all the little people in the background, that's population growth. So now you've thrown in another factor into this. So water reuse is really one way that you can start to address these challenges and deal with the issues of water conveyance, water treatment, water use, and water reuse in a sustainable manner. So with that, I will stop, and I know that was a lot to cover, but thank you for your attention, and I'll be happy to take any questions.
Yeah, thanks very much for that in-depth treatment technologies for emerging contaminants. I'm more relaxed now that you have showed us the pushing water. However, I don't know what you think.